So thanks very much for joining today's virtual boardroom. My name's Jo Thompson and I work for HR Recruit. So today's boardroom is around hybrid working. So hopefully lots of interesting points to discuss. So I'll hand you over to Marion. She's going to facilitate the session and I hope you enjoy it.
So this is a big topic to discuss in a 45-minute session. So what my aim is, as you will know if you're regulars on this, is just to sort of throw quite a lot of points out, some questions to prompt thought, and then give you the opportunity to discuss in groups, because there'll be a lot of knowledge within the room, as well as, you know, some questions and ideas that you might want to ask of each other. So hybrid working, you know, it's a term we hadn't heard of a couple of years ago. We might have talked about flexible working, and that, you know, even that was fairly limited in terms of our thinking. But it is something that came about through that rapid and dramatic sudden change to so many people working from home, and people suddenly discovering actually that it was an option when they always thought that it wasn't. But it, you know, it's different options to different people. I found it quite fascinating. I was looking for some images of working from home, and it was all these very calm, peaceful workstations with, you know, flowers on the desk and, you know, people looking clean and tidy. And actually, I don't know what other people's reality, but the picture on the left is a lot of my reality. I seem to spend half the time trying to deal with interruptions, and, you know, it's not always straightforward. But if we think about the different approaches and how companies are responding now, it's fascinating actually hearing the range of responses that companies are now getting. So this is some looking at the financial sector and seeing actually just within that the real difference. I mean, Goldman Sachs have been very open about it doesn't suit their culture. They're getting everybody back in the office as soon as they can. And initially, I thought actually it was quite well, arrogant was the word that came to mind, you know, the way it was stated. But actually, when you then heard him talk about the culture and the opportunity for, you know, new people joining the business, I think he said they had like 2,000 graduates and he wanted them to have the proper mentoring experience. It, you know, it was really interesting to hear that perspective. Whereas Deloitte, you know, they're one of the big consulting firms, have said actually they'll give their people the option to work from wherever they want forever. You know, Google work from home forever. HSBC, I know have, you know, done it on a case-by-case basis. So, you know, some organisations have more scope than others. Obviously, you know, people like Deloitte consultancy, they're working with different clients. It's easier. Whereas a lot of other organisations may not have any scope at all. So when we're talking about hybrid working, it's recognising this. And this was some work from McKinsey, which was quite interesting in terms about, you know, what model people want, what they would like, having had the opportunity to experience working from home. And some other data, it was also McKinsey, so, you know, 7% of people said they would actually change jobs if they were made to go back into the office because it had worked for them. But what I was reflecting on is the fact we are learning there's a huge difference between the emergency response that was needed to keep organisations operational, getting people working from home as quickly as they can and getting everybody through the crisis, and actually thinking about how can we make this work as an option for our organisation in the long term, because there are a whole myriad of things that then become something that we have to consider. And obviously, you know, some organisations by default pretty much have the option, nobody would have the option to work from home, whereas some there has the options for some, but not others. And then you have the dilemma of how do you decide those parameters and all the things that go through that. We then also actually have all the legal implications. You know, that wasn't something that we were considering as a short term when we had to just get it operational. But in the longer term, what are the wider things we might have to think about? You know, what do your contracts allow you to do? What would be your process of changing them? You know, would you ever want to enforce any changes or the inherent risks that there are with that? And, you know, it's not just about the place of work. there may be other contract terms that are affected by it. How do you deal with all the confidentiality, the GDPR, the confidentiality of people having meetings, Zoom calls, whatever, in spaces where other people are around? How can you be sure of the safety of the environment from that perspective? How do you manage the data? If people have printed materials at home, how do you manage the safe disposable and the fact that how they store them? All these implications, tax implications from working at home. What does that mean for people? I mean, yes, you can have an allowance, but it's about how often you're working there and all the different elements with that. Thinking about your policies and procedures, and this might just be HR ones. This obviously will be sort of IT, different health and safety ones. But how do you need to amend all your procedures aligned to your policies so they are workable for all elements of the organisation without making it really complex? And what about the insurance? Insurance at working from home, insurance for employees working at home. And what might you have to think about in that? So that's not me coming from an expert perspective on any of those. This is just about recognizing they're things that we need to consider. And then when I started to think of what else do you need to consider, the list got very long. And the more I thought about it, and the more you think you have to consider. And some of it is, or a lot of it actually, which I hadn't got as a specific heading, is about your culture. How do you really have your values, your brand, behaviors? How do you instill and demonstrate those, across a very diverse system of working? It makes all of that element much more complicated. The communication, yes, we know we need to communicate, but actually, what does that look like when you've got people working in very different ways? People have different communication preferences. They'll have different levels of the skills to actually manage those different platforms for communication. I went to a fascinating thing about digital body language. That was all in things about, the etiquette of team meetings and whether Zoom meetings, whether you turn up as it starts or 5 minutes before, and how people interpret different things, how the language in communication, how you can engage your employees, your younger employees and your older employees in language that they would use, in inclusive language. So many elements of communication that we have to think about when we haven't got the same ability to just meet people and talk to them face to face. Inclusivity, this was hopefully high on every organisation agenda before this, but actually we've already seen that there are sectors of the population that are being disadvantaged disproportionately by the working from home. Young people, working parents, they are being affected more. So how will you really ensure that you don't lose any focus on inclusivity and equality going forward? Career progression. This has been a really interesting area, I think, of debate. How do people make themselves visible? When you're in an office and, people are side by side in the meeting, you have the chance to chat with people, people form opinions, you learn how, when you're all working remotely, do you get the visibility in the same way? Thinking about the learning and the skills, if you think about, and if you use the sort of 70-20-10 model of learning, we use 70% of what we learn is just from informal learning, and we lose a lot of that opportunity if we're all working remotely. Management skills, a whole load of new skills managers will need. If they've got some people working in an office, they've got some people working remotely, mix of both. How do you manage that? How do you still keep contact? How do you keep your team together? How do you create a team, a cohesive team in that way? Say it was fine for a few months, but what happens when it goes to years? I mean, and I personally, I think all of this is possible. I mean, it's probably 20 plus years since I actually worked full time in an office. I've had field-based roles and things, and you know, I've always found it's worked. But that was, you know, just when elements of a workforce were remote rather than everybody. Performance management, you know, again, how can you manage this in the same way? How can you support improvement? Are you measuring it by different things? You know, people need different skills to be working effectively, using a lot more technology than they might have been used to in the office. Are we giving people the training and the skills to actually do that, or are we starting to measure them on different things? Well-being and mental health. Those of you that are regulars or know me know that I could do whole sessions just on this part of it. But we're seeing a lot now about the impact on people's well-being and mental health. We know the importance of connection in all well-being models. We know the impact of isolation and what it can have on anxiety and depression. So, you know, how are you going to really support your staff in their well-being? How are you going to make sure they've got developing good working habits, you know, parameters around when they switch off, the boundaries around work, you know, what behaviours are being modelled in the organisation in terms of when people are expected to be available, because they'll all impact on people's health. And then, you know, last but by far not least, you know, the practical and cost implications, you know, all the logistics, the planning around what office space do you need, how do you get around the fact that people might not have their own office, when actually we know how much people like having their own space, but you can't justify that if they're only coming into the office very infrequently, plus the cost of all the, you know, the remote technology and everything that they will need for that. So that's quite a long list just to start the thinking. And then, you know, how do you get that balance right? How do you decide or work out, you know, ultimately you need the business to be successful. You know, if we don't have successful businesses, we won't have the roles in there to be worrying about. But how do you get that balance right so you can accommodate people so they can work in their best way, because by working in their best way, it's to the business benefit, against what all the other stakeholders need to make that business successful. So there's never going to be one answer. There's never going to be a clear answer. But how can you be sure you're actually trying to get the best of all options for your organisation to take forward? So what I thought would be helpful, what I hope be helpful, is to give you the opportunity to just have a discussion around, you know, the options you might be considering, the different actions you might need to take, the processes you might need to follow, you know, how you will consider on a role-by-role basis whether it's one that can be considered for some type of working. You know, we think about hybrid working at an organisational level and hybrid working at an individual level. And, you know, my interpretation of hybrid working is actually about a mix and making that work in the best way. So let me put you into groups. Don't know how many we've got. We've got quite a few now, which is great. So, oh, yeah, there we go. You've just changed the setting, haven't you? That was last minute. Brilliant. Thank you. So I'll put you, what should we do? We'll go into groups of 4 groups. So you'll have 7 to 8. If you haven't felt comfortable putting your camera on in the main room, I'd really appreciate it if you can once you get into the breakout rooms, because then it's much easier for you to have a conversation. And really, you know, take the opportunity to share what you have experienced so far, share what you're thinking about the challenges. And then if we have a while, I'll give you 15 minutes for that conversation. And then if you want to come back and have elected somebody from your group to sort of bring back your key points, that would be really helpful. So let me get the groups going. Right, so I've dropped into a couple of the rooms to hear some of the conversation. So it would be great. So where should we go? Let's start with room, let's go start at the bottom, room 4, which was Gemma, Jeanette, Kat, your group? Do you get round to working out who was going to feedback and just summarise your discussion, or anything particular you wanted to raise in the main room?
We didn't agree. I don't know if anyone wants to speak, but I think we were talking about, I think just there's still lots of questions unanswered, and it's still quite an unknown. So it feels quite difficult to really plan. And so it feels a little bit like finding out as we go, but kind of having conversations with staff and kind of dealing with issues, but how we plan for culture change in the future that this inevitably will bring. I guess for some organisations that will be more than others, perhaps less in my organisation, because we were quite a flexible organisation anyway. So it wasn't a formal hybrid working, but people were working from home. So, but I suspect in some organisations it could be quite a big shift if people are asked to come back to the office, or whatever that might, the consequences of that. Yeah, I think that was a general sort of feeling of what we talked about. I don't know if anyone else wants to say anything. I'd pitch him.
No, I think that's a fair summary.
Thank you. So room 3 was Elaine, Beverly, Jennifer, your group.
Yeah, hi. Well, we didn't get around to deciding who should be spokesperson either.
That's fine. Hopefully that means you were still in the discussion, so that's good.
We were actually, and unfortunately we were just cut off when Laura was chatting. But I think the general consensus was that we're all still very much dependent on trust and support from senior management. There's a mix of employee expectations versus the employer, and yeah, without further data, you can't at the moment unable to put any firm plans in place. But I think also listening to those that were in manufacturing, they've had some staff on site. They now have to look at the fairness of how they bring back the remaining of their staff, so that they can see the culture not being affected by the differing of the understanding of the role responsibilities. So it is about the fairness and doing what's right for both the employee in their expectations, but also the business still has to continue.
And people's actually perceptions of fairness. You know, everybody will have their own view of what's fair. You know, so I think that's one of the many challenges.
Sure.
Group 2. Claire, Liz, Nicola.
And I'll go.
Thank you.
Okay.
Well, we had lots of discussion, and I think the conclusion was it's just so complex, and every site is so different, every individual is so different. You can do surveys, talked about, maybe having the discussions one-to-one with employees, bearing in mind anxieties, childcare issues that people have got, etc. Different parts of the business where people were already in work and some have been at home, and the conflicts that's maybe caused, or resentment that's caused, and how you manage and balance that with hybrid working when some can't do hybrid working. So it's a huge problem, I think, and I think we're all learning as we go along. There isn't sort of any one solution. I don't know about other people's companies, but in mine, it's a case of, well, you're in the people team, you tell us. Well, I haven't got all the answers. And when I ask them, they have a whole from 0 to 100 of opinions as to what should happen, as does each individual. So I think it is going to be tricky, and I think trying to start off simply and build on it or something like that is maybe a good option, but more forums like this to help us share ideas and what's gone well, what hasn't gone well, I think are really useful.
Yeah, thank you. And then group 1, which is the last group, so the group Jo was in, Jo, Gemma, Marissa.
I don't mind speaking. I think so.
Thank
What we talked about was pretty much the same as everybody else, the same things. What was interesting for me personally, though, so we started by going around the group and talking about where we were at and kind of like the different constraints and problems and challenges that each group had faced, each organisation faced. So my phone's ringing. My phone never rings. And the thing that I thought was interesting for me was because I work in a digital organisation that, you know, we all work from laptops. We were quite flexible anyway. Remote working was something that we were thinking about incorporating before all of this happened anyway. And I'm just struck by some of the challenges that other companies have had. So some of the ladies in my group have working in manufacturing or distribution where they have had to have people come into the office, and that discussion that people were having around the fairness and the equability of some people working remotely because they can and other roles where they can't. For me, that's just not something that ever factors in because we can do that. So I'm just struck by how challenging it might be for some companies and some teams and some managers when that really is a big deal to kind of manage that people can have roles that are flexible and other ones can't. How do you deal with the kind of the ramifications of that? And I think there's just a long way to go on making people feel like their roles are being treated fairly, and you know that they've got the flexibility that they would want, and there's no envy of kind of, you know, people who can work from home but their roles can't. So that was one thing that struck me from the conversations that we've been having now.
Sorry, can I just add to that as well? One of the things that we discussed as well in our group was around the sort of dilution of working time and family stroke home time. And Marissa, you were saying about you'll have a meeting and then your boss's kids will come into the meeting, and you find it hard to structure meetings with some of your colleagues because they're doing a drop off in the morning, they're doing a collection in the afternoon, which is fine, but that can obviously also add additional challenges. And it's just about, I suppose, how do you try and have separate work time and home time from a personal point of view, but also when you're trying to, you know, speak about work with some of your colleagues as well.
Yeah, and finding time. I think I'm sure that everyone has had the same kind of thing, that we've noticed that in the last 12 months, everything's been diarised. So you have a meeting with someone about a thing, you finish the meeting, you go on to another meeting about a thing, and you've kind of got to make those blocks of time. And when someone's got something, it's very hard to know, well, can they move that meeting and are they available then? And so, yeah, the managing of time, particularly when some are flexible working remotely, and we're now back where we're in a situation where some of the teams are in some of the time, so we do a few people together, but then we'll have to dial people in. So do we all sit around one laptop and do that, or do we do it from different rooms so there's no echo of people speaking over each other and things? So there's lots of logistical challenges. And, you know, we're even talking about, do we reconfigure our office so that we've got more individual meeting rooms so that we can do more remote calls? And those are things that we haven't got to the bottom of yet, because we haven't got that far into the process to know how often will people be working from home versus, and in what kind of size and group numbers will that be? So yeah, there's a lot to work through.
Yeah, I think, yeah, Joe's point on the work-life balance, or I think I prefer sort of the phrase integration, but you know, it's because I think we can integrate them better so we have the flexibility we want, but within that we have to have clear boundaries, and I think that's where it's going wrong for a lot of people. They're not, you know, while the laptop's on one side of the kitchen when they're cooking dinner, they'll go and check an email while, you know, the rice is cooking. And, you know, we have to create the same boundaries alongside having the flexibility, if that makes sense. But again, back to Marissa's point, combining that with organisational needs, you know, it's got to work. We can't allow everybody to get the balance that works for them, that then causes chaos for the organisation. So I think the discussion has just reiterated, I guess, I hope none of you were expecting to come away from here with clear answers. It, you know, reiterated just actually how complex it is. But one observation from listening to the discussion, I think, being mindful of not, whilst we absolutely have to think about the processes, the practicalities, you know, particularly while we're still living with social distancing. I mean, at some point, hopefully we'll move beyond those parameters to how we live. but actually don't focus totally on who wants to be at work and who wants to be in the office, who wants to be at home as the logistics, and neglect all the other things that we were talking about right at the beginning. Because I think if we don't factor those into our consideration now, they will catch up with us later, and it will be the organisations, you know, that have considered that will be succeeding in the future. You know, with their succession planning and all that side of it. So not that you haven't got enough to do, but, you know, how you can think about all those different elements when you're doing your planning, rather than just about, well, you know, does this person want to work here or here, and how does that work with the rest of the team, would be my observation. And to be creative. You know, if there was one thing that we learned last year, is that we can implement major changes at pace when we want to. And actually don't get caught back into those, you know, slow procedures of change that we worked by before. You know, try and keep that innovation and the pace up in the right place, whilst doing all the things you need to do, and reassuring staff that, you know, are finding difficulty with change and uncertainty. Well, we will never get it all right, but I think the more we think about those different elements will be helpful. So yeah, I hope this has given you the opportunity just to have a bit more time to think about it in relation to your organisation and you know, the wider context reflection time. Somebody said it's useful to have these discussion opportunities. We've got, Joe will tell us, we've got a more open social networking one in a couple of, was it 2 weeks? So, you know, people can carry on. We haven't got any fixed agenda, so, you know, people can come back and carry on discussion around that. Just before we break, or I'll finish and I hand back to Joe, I'm just going to put in a request. So I just want to share my details. I am about to start some research around self-compassion in female HR professionals, and I'm still looking for a few more participants. So if anybody might be interested in taking part in that, it's a couple of questions online, and then it will be about an hour's interview. So the criteria are working in an HR role, which you are by virtue of being here, and being a member or fellow of the CIPD as criteria for taking part. So if anybody would be interested, my contact details are there, and I would appreciate a few more volunteers. So with that, can I just pass back to Joe?
Okay, thanks very much everybody for attending. We really appreciate it, and we hope that you've got quite a lot out of it. I'm going to do a LinkedIn post this afternoon, and then I will send an email to everybody that's signed up for the event. So if you could put a comment against the post, I'd really appreciate it. And if you do want a copy of the recording or anything like that, then just put a comment against the post. We've got another boardroom in 2 weeks' time. That's about hybrid working, and then the open house one that Marion mentioned, we've got that one in August, so I will attach a link to those boardrooms if you do want to sign up for those. We've also launched about 3 or 4 months ago a guild networking group as well for HR professionals, and that's been really successful as well. And I know that a few of you are already members of it, but I will attach a link to that as well if you are interested in signing up for that. But otherwise, I'd just like to say thank you very much, and yeah, thanks. I hope you got a lot out of it.